Right, we are rather honoured to have Paul Sweeney with us. Paul is a member of the Scottish Labour and Cooperative Party and currently serves as member of the Scottish Parliament for the Glasgow region. He is the Scottish Labour shadow spokesperson for mental health and veterans. He is also passionate about urban regeneration and takes active interest in built environment and building conservation issues, serving as a trustee of the Glasgow City Heritage Trust and as chair of the Springburn Winter Gardens Trust. He will speak for as long as he wants, and then he will take questions. So I think I've already said there are quite a lot of helpful experience in the room, and he's looking forward to hearing your questions when he's spoken. Paul, it's up to you.
Good afternoon. Last time I was in here, I was actually doing a best man speech, so I feel like it's not as much pressure today. Because I'm amongst friends and talking about an issue which we all care about deeply, and one that's quite challenging. I suppose I get interested in the built environment and retrofit, like a lot of Glaswegians, by wondering what happened to our city. Sitting with my granda, looking at these old books of Glasgow and thinking about Springburn, where I grew up, and realising with every turn of the page in the examination of these old black and white photographs that not much of it was left, and listening to my granda explaining how, this was once a tight-knit, vibrant community with a purpose and a sort of coherence to it, which was fairly violently decimated in a short space of time. And indeed, it's reflective of the building we're standing in today, a beautiful Italianate church built in the 1870s in the heart of the district of Cowcaddens. And if you might have seen in the papers this week that the Alistair Gray picture, Cowcaddens in the 50s, has been bought by Glasgow Museums, and it's going to be put into Kelvin Grove. But if you actually look at that painting, there isn't much left of Cowcaddens in the 50s today other than this church, really. One of the 29 comprehensive development areas that were designated in Glasgow in the 1960s and 1970s, of which Springburn was the last. But the upshot of it was it basically meant that 80% of Springburn's built environment was demolished in a 10-year period. Violent social engineering that went on in this city on a scale which is probably unparalleled in Europe outside of a wartime situation. And we're still dealing with that today. And I think the utopianism that governed the post-war period, the idea of modernist planning, the idea of huge restructuring, and the vast amounts of capital that were available to do all of that aren't necessarily, available to us today to deliver these mega projects, building new towns, expressways, mass reconstruction. But we also simply can't view it, I think, in binary terms that this was the agenda that was settled. There was resistance at the time, and actually the legacy of that resistance to the mass destruction of the city lay in the formation of the Community Housing Association movement in Glasgow, which has been a great legacy, of which there is over 80 community housing associations in the city today. Some notable examples include Reedvale in Denniston, which was formed of local residents saying, by the way, you're not knocking our tenements down and dispersing our community, we want to save these flats and renovate them. And of course in Govan as well, where the very first experiment was done to put an internal toilet into a tenement to demonstrate with art school students and a local resident that the tenements could be renovated. And I think the corporation at the time, I think it was the toilet was actually opened by the Lord Provost of the day, so quite a bathroom, But anyway, the point is that I think the corporation then suddenly realised they'd knocked down 100,000 tenements that could have largely have been rehabilitated, and it was a gross mistake. We're kind of on the precipice of a similar challenge, that we went through a programme of mass renovations of Glasgow's tenements in the 1970s and 1980s. Some were good renovations, others were terrible. You actually can tell the ones that are kind of rubbish by walking around Glasgow today and seeing what sandstone facades are starting to blister off because they simply cleaned the stone of the tenements by smearing glue on them and throwing sand at them in a process called liner stone. So there was some pretty crap retrofit work done in the past. So I guess the point is we can't simply take a tokenistic approach to it now. We have to really think about a comprehensive codifying approach to Glasgow's retrofit. And that's going to be a big challenge for us. How do we do that? Because there's a lot of tension at play. There's the human rights of people, there's also the property rights of people, and which trumps, and also simply pursuing one's self-interest at the expense of the collective interest is also a big challenge. So how do you square those tensions in the policy system? In the past it was very much, this is what we, the planners, have decided is good for Glasgow, and you need to get out of the way while we deliver our grand vision from on high. We might have replaced that with a form of mass owner occupation and sort of DIY approaches to property improvement and so on. But now we need to find a common way forward. A good example would be tenements in the city. So we have, despite the orgy of demolition, around 70,000 pre-1919 tenements in the city, with an estimated repair backlog of around £3 billion. So it's quite a big challenge. And then there's another 6,000 or so villas and sort of terraced housing of the pre-1919 period. Tenements were built usually under a viewing system by a single property developer and rented out, and they were managed and factored by a landlord in a very coherent way. Nowadays, they're usually in fairly fragmented ownership because they've been sold off over the years. How do you make a system of cooperation function in that context? Very challenging. And this doesn't just go for retrofit in the sense of energy efficiency, it goes in the sense of any basic maintenance. And it's a huge challenge that we need to sort in the city. And I know that the Scottish Law Commission, for example, is currently undertaking a project to look at how we reform tenement law. But what you realise when you get elected to Parliament is that there is no magic group of wizards in a room somewhere who has all the solutions. Because I actually met the commissioner who's leading the project, and not to be rude about it or anything like that, but like it was just that she was like, I don't have the answers, like we just open to ideas. And if Glasgow can get out ahead of this and actually demonstrate models that might work, then let's codify that, let's bottle that and try and scale it up. So that's really my reflection back to everyone today, that when you get in there and sit down, you're like, oh, it's just those guys. There's no experts somewhere. And that's the power of the democracy as well, that the parliamentary system allows us to be conduits as parliamentarians to carry these ideas into the centre of power and try and impress on people who make decisions to do the right thing. It will be a big challenge because, the legislation and historically our legislation has promoted property rights over human rights. And that's a power imbalance that we do need to address, because the human rights of us as citizens, as a collective country, needs to overcome the selfish interests of property owners, potentially landlords who aren't interested in high, good quality maintenance. So how we solve that cooperatively will be a big challenge. One idea that's been put forward is the idea of common sinking funds, so that you don't actually pay a factoring fee into a housing association in the sense, or a private factor with it just disappearing into a blank account. It would actually be lodged in an account associated with the building that you live in, and that when you move away or change residence, you wouldn't take that money or that deposit with you. It would stay with the property, and that way you could properly manage a building life cycle in the longer term and sustainably finance that. There's no mechanism to achieve that just now legally. So how do we design that system? How do we pilot that system? I think that's going to be a major challenge for us, but I'm intrigued to know what you might think about how to do that, and if we can come together and try and promote some practical methods of how to test it in Glasgow. I think that would be really powerful. Also, just institutional capacity. I had someone phone me last night, actually, an architect, who isn't a supporter of my party, incidentally, a supporter of the governing party, the SNP. But he's like, what are they doing? Because they're about to introduce this, you can't install new gas boilers after next year, I think it is. And he was saying this potentially could stop dead the construction industry because the supply chain just isn't there. That's his assertion. I don't know if it's true or not. I'm sure people in the room might have a differing view of that. But one big challenge will be, how do you get the supply chain to respond at scale? And what should the government be doing to promote capacity building? To ensure that supply chain is there? Could we be doing more in Glasgow? Could we be building municipal capacity in a way which we haven't done for many years? So we do have a city construction company, city building. Could we be doing more to promote that as a source of installation, of retrofit, of building up the apprentices needed, training people, manufacturing more of the products that we need in the city? Interested to know what you might think about how feasible that might be. How do you use public investment and public risk bearing to help drive this change? And there is that tension of you jump to utopia without getting the mechanisms in place to get there, and it can often cause unintended consequences as a result. There are also other major issues. So, for example, how we calculate gross domestic product in our country is a huge perverse incentive. So if we demolish something and build something new, it's counted in that year's annual GDP figures. But if we renovate something, it isn't. So how do we fix that problem? And one of the weird things that the Treasury does to try and incentivise economic growth is to charge 20% VAT on retrofitting and renovation, but 0% on demolition and new build to try and incentivise new construction. But it's actually driving an orgy of destruction that's unnecessary. So how do we fix that? And I have often said this, I said it both as an MP and as an MSP, how do we fix this weird situation with VAT? And what always came back from the Treasury was, how is it going to be paid for? This is X hundreds of millions or billions in revenue. What's the gap and how will you fill it? So I guess we need to answer that question, because that's the basic, opportunity that we need to plug. What extra economic growth would it drive? What waste would it solve in our economy? I think that's a huge opportunity for us to put the case towards. It should be an easy win and one that could be implemented rapidly, but it is absurd, yet they stick rigidly to it. There's been interesting proposals in Scotland as well. I know the CIOBT, for example, has proposed having a demolition levy, which would be a way for us under devolved competence to look at levelling the playing field somewhat. And I think that's another opportunity we could look at, and how would that practically help change behaviour. I also know that HES have considered the idea of having a VAT offsetting scheme. How would that be financed? How could that work in terms of promoting better decision making? It seems though retrofit is a major buzzword, is at the heart of a lot of discussions. There still continues to be a major attitudinal problem when it comes to big institutional property development. We just see it in Glasgow right now with some of the biggest proposals forthcoming about mass demolition. So we've got Buchanan Galleries, we've got the Keynote Centre, for example. Is this the best way forward? There's a lot of buildings that are probably quite easily adaptable. What do we need to do to change building regulations to make looser fit adaptations easier to achieve? So we've got over 400 redundant office buildings in Glasgow city centre. I think the combined office space or combined empty commercial floor space in Glasgow is equivalent to the space inside the Empire State Building in New York. So it's a vast latent opportunity for this city. And also we have in Glasgow the lowest residential city centre population in the UK of any major British city. So I think it's around 20,000 compared to Manchester, which has about 48,000 people living in the city centre. And they've doubled that in the last decade and are going to double it again in the next decade. And we're talking about just getting to around 40,000 by the mid-2030s. So the rate in which Glasgow's changing its situation isn't good enough. And I don't think we have the institutional capacity to do much about it. So a good example was just the other week there when the city published the Golden Z strategy. I always thought it was a bit of a twee term, Golden Z. It's up there with the Wall Street on Clyde. I remember the Evening Times used to come up with these daft monikers for things. But the Golden Z basically refers to Buchanan Street, Sulkhill Street and Argyll Street as this kind of retail spine that the city kind of presented in the early 2000s as its kind of new economic renaissance. And as with many things in Glasgow, we often put our eggs in one basket. And then when something goes terribly wrong, we suffer a big shock. And lo and behold, COVID happened, and people haven't necessarily come back in numbers to the city centre in this sort of 12-hour period where people would drive to work in the city, go to bars, restaurants, shops. So how do we resolve that? It is to basically reinflate Glasgow's urban population. Anne McClary, the former director of the Glasgow Building Preservation Trust, I remember meeting her to discuss Springboard Winter Gardens about 10 years ago, how we fix it, and talking about Springboard more generally. And she was saying the problem is, Paul, that Glasgow's a bit like one of those people that have been on a diet, and then they stand with their jeans that they used to, the waistbands out to here. So it's a city that was built for twice as many people that actually live in it. So we have a lot of people rattling around in a city. Not necessarily the sufficient demand to sustain all these buildings. So how do we structurally reinfuse the city with people, get that density back? I think it's a huge challenge for us. That will require major adaptations, because I speak to property developers all the time in Glasgow, and they're saying a lot of these buildings just aren't suited to conversion to residential under current building regulations. So how do we change that to make it easier to make the right decisions and to avoid huge urban blight and huge waste when we have 18,000 people sitting on social housing waiting lists in Glasgow? And that's just an estimate, because we don't have a coherent single housing register for the city. And also, we aren't going to be able to build our way out of this problem either. I think something like by 2050, 80% of the buildings will be ones that are already here. So this isn't going to be a challenge where we can just build our way out of it. We have to deal with the current building stock. So I'm really interested in what we can do to build the institutional capacity, because it's clear that we've been so wedded to a laissez-faire model for too long, that we get the right price signals, that we set some rules and passively stand back as a state and just allow the market to function well. I don't think that's sufficient. Glasgow had a great history of municipalism and driving capacity. In fact, Glasgow, up until 20 years ago, was the second biggest social landlord in the world after Hong Kong. So the city has done big, bold things in the past, and I think it can do again. It has some of the legacy of that. Fantastic community-run housing associations, the biggest span of democratic control over its housing stock probably of any city in the UK. The institutional means of driving positive change. Around a quarter of the tenements I mentioned are under housing association control. We have a city construction company. How do we build all these things together to form something really powerful? I think we have some expert ideas in this room. In fact, I was at a talk by a local home retrofit just the other night, if our doors open day, and there was some really good advice coming forward from that. But again, it's how do we scale this really great thinking up to seriously change the pace of Glasgow's reforms? I think that's going to be a big challenge for us. So I'm open about what we can do. If we can crack this in Glasgow, I think it will lead the country towards a better place, because I think all eyes are on us to show the leadership. The Law Commission, for example, are willing to draft legislation that will reflect a pilot that we can prove works in Glasgow at scale. So on that note, really, without boring you any further, I would just like to sort of ask you if you've got any thoughts about how we can do this. For me, it's not for me to come here and offer a neatly packaged solution. It's about trying to suggest a way forward, which is to build this institutional capacity in Glasgow. How do we get there? How do we build the structures of cooperation necessary to win this prize, which is a far better built environment, a far more environmentally efficient city, a denser city, and one which is much more financially sustainable as well, because we know that the city has been financially distressed for a very long time, and it feels like we're paying more to get less every year. So how do we turn this all on its head? I'm interested to know. Okay.
Hi Paul, how you doing? Just a couple of thoughts. I don't know how you react to them. It's just two of them. It's just you're talking about building up that the municipality kind of like ability to tackle retrofit. We've been trying to do that, and every time we go into schools to try and raise awareness and encourage school children to join the construction industry, it is just about we're met with a complete blank. It's we talked earlier on about mindsets. There's a real mindset to up the image of construction within the general public, and I just wondered what you might say about that, because I've gone along to schools and we're lucky if we get 5 pupils actually coming into a classroom to meet and speak to us about the construction industry. The other question was about the CIOB. and the demolition fund, which you kind of mentioned. Well, the demolition levy. There's another idea kicking around about a demolition fund as opposed to a demolition levy, that would actually, like, the money created from the demolition fund could then be put back into the maintenance and improvement of buildings. So it's just a couple of ideas there, Paul, or if you've got anything to say about them.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think it is alarming to note that the construction industry workforce in Scotland declined from 241,000 in 2018 to 231,000 last year. So it's not a good picture. And there's a similar issue across different trades. So my background's in the shipbuilding industry. And one of the big challenges has been, for the first time, actually many years, the shipyard in Glasgow wasn't able to fully recruit its apprentice programme. And it's similar problems. They've actually now got to the point where they've removed all academic entry qualifications for apprenticeship programmes in the shipbuilding industry, but they've actually found that that's been an incredible way to access people who the school system, the formal education system failed them, but they're actually incredibly gifted people who just wanted a break, and they've found that opportunity being extended to people has met with incredible characters who are really willing to learn, understand, and even though they're not necessarily in a formal apprenticeship program initially, they're known as trade assistants, I think. It's a way for people who otherwise would be excluded from these opportunities to get access. So maybe it's a similar opportunity we need to look at, that a lot of young people are failed by our education system, the formal structures. I think we saw it most markedly during the COVID crisis, where, shockingly, if you had performed exactly the same on a certain exam paper, if you'd been at a private school, you'd have got an A, and if you'd been at a state school in a poor area, you would have got a D. I just think that was quite an alarming realisation of how appalling our current structures are and how much it's failing young people. So I think, there's a lot to be done about sort of showcasing the opportunities for trades, working with our college sector to try and build that up. Maybe again, it's about having some sort of construction skills excellence academy, looking at how we use projects like the Glasgow School of Art restoration to try and rebuild craft trades that are almost on the brink of extinction, stonemasonry, etc. What was quite cool actually was visiting the Construction Skills Academy at City Building in Springburn recently, which they've just opened, and the plumbers are all still learning how to do lead work for roofs, which I thought was quite good to see. So there's still people out there who can do these things, but also just maybe trying to achieve economies of scale as well. Like looking at where different contractors are trying to invest in these trades and trying to build structures of cooperation where not necessarily one contractor can carry the overhead for these things, but if there's a way to support them to do something in cooperation with other contractors and the state and the college sector, we could maybe crack some of this at scale, whether it is things like, stained glass manufacture, sash and case window making, or traditional slate roof construction, etc. These are all things I think we should think about. How do we do that? I know certainly with the engine works that HES have established in Stirling, there's some attempt to do that, but how do we make it even more impactful? That's a good point.
Thank you, Paul. That was very interesting. And I got a couple of points, if you allow me. You talked about the Sync Fund. I think Edinburgh has done a report some time ago. I was asked to comment and I didn't follow up what's happened to it, about stair association or stair funds, as sync funds, like the one you talked about. And there was a report that was floating around to be implemented, as policy. Not sure where it got to. David, do you know where it got to? You're looking at me quizzically.
No, I've never heard of it before, so there you go. We need to go out and find some of this stuff. There's probably loads of amazing gems lying around in dusty offices and bookshelves.
I don't know if it's actually implemented. If it's not, then I can send you it and maybe make it happen. The second thing is about VAT. We always hear about, we're going to build how many hundreds of thousands of houses every year to cope with blah, 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 blah. Surely there's a back of an envelope calculation is sufficient to say, if we charge VAT to new builds, take away VAT for retrofit and put, whether it's a levy or VAT on demolition, surely the coffers of HMRC would be covered. And also, as you say, re-densify or refill the empty places we want to actually fill. That's surely very sensible, straightforward calculation can be done, given how many new build housing, the developers are trying to punt out there.
No, I think it's a really powerful point. I think the challenge back to industry and to everyone who's got a concern in this is to make that case in economic terms, because what's happened is there's been a demand issued saying let's get rid of VAT because it's creating this problem, but it's the challenge of, do you govern by accountancy or govern by economics? And they're simply looking at the national income accounts and saying, I'm losing this revenue from the exchequer, how do I plug the gap through another means or another form of activity that will incentivise? So how do we make that case? How do we present an economic analysis that delivers that? And I think it's a fair point. I guess there'll be a very strong construction industry lobby against levying VAT on new build, which would be pretty overwhelming. So then again, there's a challenge as well. How do we overcome some of these challenges? It isn't an easy solution, but I'm up for helping make the case, and up for helping present that analysis in a coherent way. And I think your point about if there are practical business models out there of how residents associations, sinking funds, stair funds, if you like, can operate, then let's look at that. One thing that Glasgow does have to its advantage is such a rich tapestry of community housing associations that are readily made to take up that role within communities. So for example, I have a flat that I bought, I'm a mortgage holder, but my factor is a local housing association. So how do we build and develop that? Or how do we make more cooperation around expertise? So, a lot of these buildings are complex, they're old, they're built to standards that aren't current. A lot of engineers going to look at these properties don't really understand traditional building standards. So how do we actually create the centre of excellence within the city that understands that? We've certainly got the City Heritage Trust, of which I'm on the board of. Could we build that up into something in concert with the Building Preservation Trust and some of the local housing associations and other experts to be a one-stop shop for retrofit advice, guidance, building MOTs, if you like, where we can provide assured reports for people to pursue conservation maintenance on their properties and retrofit on their properties with decent advice, and they aren't getting line of stone or PVC windows. These are all things we need to crack. So I think if there is insights and papers that are already published and are available for reference, that would be really helpful to know about. So thanks for that.
Hi, Paul. Thanks very much for the very interesting presentation. Chris Kerrs from Local Home Retrofit. I want to talk about timelines and the ponderous speed at which the Scottish Parliament is dealing with these issues. We heard earlier on, one of the presenters was saying it's 6 years until we expect to hit the levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide that lead to 1.5 degree warming, which is the level at which all the scientists say is when things like global food systems start to break down, there's food shortages, the level of damage to infrastructure means that, the stability of the financial system globally becomes under threat. That's 6 years away. If you look back 6 years, that's when the Scottish Government first started consulting on minimum energy efficiency standards. And we're still, I think we're going to be expecting another consultation on it this year, just on MEES. So maybe government isn't the answer. Maybe government should be trying to get out of the way. Maybe municipalism is too much of a cultural shift that takes too long. And, how, and you can imagine where I'm going. Like, how can the government get out of the way and empower communities to take action faster?
That's a fair point. And I think it hints towards what I'm saying around there's almost that Spider-Man meme where someone's standing pointing at each other and they're kind of pointing back at each other, and it's like the Scottish Law Commissioner saying to the Tenement Maintenance Working Group, come up with a workable solution and we'll write a legislative code that will make it effective across the country. The challenge is really the tragedy of the commons. Everyone acting in their own selfish interest militates against the collective good, and the only way to really address that is through some sort of compulsion. There's a number of different ways in which this is challenging. So we're so wedded to the idea of shopping around for best energy supplier that the idea of having a district heat network is completely unworkable currently, or at least is very limited in its application, because the consumer right trumps the collective good. So for example, to scale up a district heat network for the Glasgow city centre based on a river source heat pump on the Clyde would require a density of commitments or subscriptions to that district heat network for it to be economically viable. Yet the current legislation militates against that. So like, how do we reform these things whilst also understanding that there is a willingness amongst the citizenry to cooperate to get this thing done for the good of our planet, for the good of our collective well-being. That is a challenge. I will admit I'm as frustrated as you are about the slow pace of government. I was actually at an event with some urban planners from Italy, and they were saying, actually, if you think Scotland's slow, Italy's even worse. but I think it's maddening for me. You know, we've talked about compulsory sale orders for over a decade. I think it was a report published by the Built Environment Forum Scotland years ago, or the Scottish Land Commission, years ago. And we're still no further forward on it because they're terrified of being interdicted in the European Court of Human Rights. Because, I mean, if you want to go into the technical detail of it, all of Europe's kind of property legislation, human rights legislation, was drafted with the idea of it being anti-communist. So, like, there's a huge suspicion in law or presumption in law against the idea of some sort of collectivization. So that's a real challenge to overcome, or state encroachment on private property rights. So let's not be so risk averse though, because I think they're kind of hyping up the risk and not actually understanding the nature of the reward or the urgency in which we need to act. And that's why civil servants have been, you know, pressing government ministers not to sort of bring it forward as a draft bill on things like reform of compulsory purchase powers, reform of CSOs, or introduction of CSOs. Similarly, changing planning law to make it compulsory that you would need to sign up to a local district heat network where it's there. It was absurd, frankly, that just a few months ago there was a new social housing project completed in Dalmarnock right next to the district heat network at the Athletes Village, and it's all got gas boilers in it when they could have, for the sake of a few £1,000s extra capital, connected to the district heat network, but there was no compulsion to do so. So these are all things we need to fix in legislation, otherwise it's down to individual actors and they're not reliable actors. So whilst I take your point, there is a ground up approach. We need to use that to test the practical application, because it's easy to write bad legislation. It's better to understand what works and try and write law to reflect that behaviour or that activity than to just second guess what in theory might look like it works well. You know, it's very hard to write legislation for this and to assume good faith. We've seen that in quite a few instances in the last few years where laws just don't work well in practice. So I think it's about a symbiotic relationship and how we make that work better. There's a lot of political pressure that needs to come from the Parliament, I think, against the government to say, and indeed the bureaucracy, you know, against that structure which is against reform at pace. To say, like, here's examples where it's working really well, we need to scale this into a national behaviour. You know, the Clydebank District Heat Network, for example, Star Refrigeration have installed. That's a Glasgow-based manufacturing company, highly skilled people manufacturing in the city, installed on the Clyde, and can basically take the whole town of Clydebank off the gas grid. So why don't we have 20 of those power stations along the river that could take an entire city region off the gas grid almost overnight? Two reasons: we don't have the planning obligations, like I mentioned, to encourage that cooperation, but the tying of the electricity price to the gas price means that you can't get the renewable electric supply to those pumps to make it cost effective, even with the current spike or the increase in gas prices. So it's nuts. You know, it's actually cheaper to pay for a private wire from Whiteley Wind Farm, dig all the roads up between Whiteley, Eaglesham and the Clyde, than it would be, it's crazy. That's what you're talking about, to try and circumvent the current price structures. So these things need to be sorted, but like you're overcoming a culture that isn't suited to this idea of like collectivization. Anyway, it's a tricky one to fix, and it's terrifying to think we're staring down the barrel of that clock ticking down all the while. You're right, the Parliament and the government isn't moving fast enough, and the question then comes back to how do we agitate for that pace to be increased. I think if you can present clear, distinct, very obvious practical solutions, then it's easier to get people to write laws that reflect those.
As someone who is trying to set up a regional retrofit hub, we've seen the Scottish Government funding the climate hubs. I think we should have funding for regional retrofit hubs, absolutely. You know, and the skills piece, yeah, getting kids into the system and going into construction, totally advocate for that. But we don't have time. We need to transition people with the skills now. And you know, it frustrates me. I'm trying to be controlled in my description here, but it frustrates me that, you know, I mean Aberdeen, slightly different kind of makeup of a demographic, but we talk about skills per industry, and, you know, in Aberdeen, really, there's only about 10,000 people directly recruited in oil and gas. We could create 4,000 jobs if we were doing the retrofit thing properly in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. So, you know, there are scaffolders and painters who work offshore. So I don't think it's necessarily a skills gap we face, it's a knowledge gap. Yeah, I think talking more broadly about the whole spectrum of a just transition would really help. And I share Chris's frustration with the speed of pace. You know, I engaged with the colleges in Aberdeen to see how they could help train local contractors in retrofit. They said they were obviously they have to deliver the Scottish syllabus. They were waiting for 2 years for a report on what the green skills were going to be. I got $5,000 from an oil and gas company and ran training sessions in the college with specialist consultants. So I think little bits of cash in the right places, we can really make things go a long way and accelerate things. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a bang on observation to make. One of the big challenges has been certain accreditations, certain skills just aren't recognised across different sectors. So one of the big challenges with the just transition that you discussed there is how do you make oil and gas related codes, qualifications, competencies, you know, translate into retrofitting and construction. I think there's an obvious way we can do that, and that requires an intelligent government approach to accreditation and to support organisations, you know, accrediting bodies to do that. Similarly, I think it's perverse to my mind that we've got Glasgow City College consulting on redundancies, compulsory redundancies, when there's massive industrial demand for through-life skills training out there, but they aren't being entrepreneurial enough as institutions to respond to that demand. And it's basically, I get paid to, you know, put bums on seats in lecture theatres to teach HNDs and HNCs in some, you know, very siloed way, but they're not out there going, right, what is it the local economy requires in terms of skills? Let's design those courses. Let's actually stop necessarily talking about early careers, people coming out of schools into colleges, and talking about someone mid-career, someone towards the end of their career trying to transition into a new, not necessarily a completely new job, but something that might require some upskilling or some education in the latest techniques and so on. How do we actually make it more agile and responsive to that? And I think that's where you need to liberate college principals to act more entrepreneurially. So currently they're non-departmental public bodies. If they were set up as public corporations, for example, which are more like universities, then they would be able to have more autonomy to sort of react to the local economic conditions and speak to people like yourself and say, right, let's put together a suite of courses. Actually, how do we then front load that with financing, bursaries, or even just stipends that allow people to come out of a certain job where they've been earning or accustomed to a certain wage and not necessarily take a financial hit for a year or 18 months while they reskill in something else. I think this is the bridge we need to start building, and that would certainly help matters, and particularly in the sense of Aberdeen, where there is a lot of tension right now about this kind of cliff edge. So yeah, so there we go.
The Hurricane Hugo in Charleston about 25 years ago devastated all the seaward-facing buildings. And the way they devised for the restoration, because there was nobody but nobody who understood these buildings, is they took an old naval base and they set up something called the Charleston College of the Building Arts. And they got people from Williamsburg and everywhere to come in and train kids in traditional methods of construction, sustainability. That was a great success. That's what we need in Scotland, I think. I mean, that was a very simple, straightforward scheme, and it's worked. But my question really is this. When Notre Dame burns down, it gets restored. It only burnt down once. Unlike Glasgow School of Art. How does it take us so long to even decide what we're going to do? This is an international embarrassment. Do you have a view on that point?
No, I think your point is really well made about the opportunity to create this institutional capacity around skills and training. It's something that we ought to sort of build up in Scotland. And you're right, there's great examples. I mean, there's cooperatives out there. We've seen, local home retrofit. We've got, even things like Jangling Space and Shawlands, which are kind of trying to steward traditional skills and things like stained glass manufacturing. Is how do you scale that idea up, that idea of participation, that idea of making it something that's part of a community. I think that's really key. How do you make it part of the school curriculum? How do you actually take that idea of bringing these crafts and introducing these crafts in, rather than making a spice rack? How do you actually do something more relevant to the practical problems facing our communities today? So I think you're definitely spot on with that idea. In respect of like big projects, so for example, Glasgow Cathedral has a stonemason's yard. It's a perpetual project of trying to maintain that historic building. I actually managed to climb the top of the steeple there a week there, which was fantastic. A kind of fairly unique view of the city. I spun the little cockerel around on the top. That was quite cool. But the point is that these big projects, whether it's the House of Commons restoration, whether it's the Glasgow Cathedral, we've obviously talked about Historic Environment Scotland and the future of their estate, as well as the Glasgow School of Art. These are projects which should be seed funding and like creating the impetus for building these critical mass of skills up. So you're right in that sense. We can use this public procurement as a demand signal, and the colleges and so on should be responding to that. So I think there's something in that for sure. With regards to the Glasgow School of Art specifically, I think it's going to take 2 years to dry the building out. So they've had to put a tent on top of it because it was lashed with rain over the last couple of years while it's been sitting in limbo. So all the stonework's really badly saturated. It's just a very sad story altogether. I mean, there'll be one hell of a book written one day about it, I'm sure. But I'll be here another hour talking about Glasgow School of Art, so I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Hi, Roger Curtis from Hess, as it happens. Thanks, Paul, for your sort of analysis about post-war Glasgow and how that sort of played out. I think one of the lessons from this morning is that local solutions or community-based solutions are going to be a big part of the retrofit solution. Do you have any views on the size of the Glasgow City Administration? Because not that long ago, it was much smaller units, wasn't it? Do you think that perhaps there's a review of the city administration needed to address the retrofit question, but indeed many other issues that the city needs to face? Do you think it's got too big and unworkable? So do you think there's some sort of structural rearrangement can unlock some of these issues, particularly retrofit and refurbishment and the re-densification of the city that you touched on?
Yeah, I mean, Glasgow had a population of 1.1 million in the 1950s, currently has a population just over 600,000. So it's a big structural change, but a lot of them are spatially just in different parts of the city region now. So maybe we do need to, redraw our municipal spans of control to reflect that reality of how people live in this region. I think that's a fair point. It's one I've long advocated for. The 1996 local government reform was a joke. It was a Tory gerrymandering exercise. Really, it's meaningless in terms of the boundaries that were drawn. But that aside, I think your point's important as well. We do have a lot of, for example, community housing associations that do a good job of being social landlords, but don't necessarily have the headspace or capacity or expertise to respond to the big challenge of retrofit of their housing stock. So how do we create a centre of excellence that they can all plug into? So one of the things I've been trying to advocate for is the creation of some sort of institution in Glasgow. It's a joint venture between the council. Wheatley Group is the biggest social landlord in the city. Some of the bigger RSLs like NG Homes, Parkhead Housing Association, Govan Housing Association, and the likes of the City Heritage Trust, the Building Preservation Trust, maybe Local Home Retrofit and others, to come together and say, right, together we're going to build this one-stop shop of expert guidance. We'll MOT your tenement building. We'll provide you with the expert specification you require to maintain it to a high standard. We'll provide you with the patient financing necessary. And we will then, provide you with a network of contractors that are accredited to perform the works to high standard. And we can continue to then give you ongoing factoring support. Like that would be my goal that would be my gold standard goal for Glasgow. And then we could just rattle through whole districts with this project. That would be my idea. And then if you can make it work practically, if it stacks up financially, I'm not saying it does because I haven't done the numbers, or even got the heads of terms together amongst those names I mentioned. So I hope I'm not like putting anyone behind the 8 ball there, but an idea. But if we could make something that works, stick it together, then you can write the legislation to scale it up as a national exercise, and then start codifying those sinking funds and so on that would underpin it all. So I think if we could move towards something like that, then all of those housing associations could say, well, we want a piece of that, we want to sign up to this project. Can you do all our housing stock? Private owners would want to sign up to it as well and pay their money to someone who they knew was a good quality customer friend, as opposed to some fly-by-night factor who just takes their money for old rope. So that was my idea.
Before I asked the question, I was through in Brussels in June for European Sustainable Energy Week, and that kind of one-stop shop has already been developed and is running in multiple European countries. Spain has a national retrofit strategy. They are currently testing on the Balkans. So that's the one-stop shop, the subsidies, every single thing to make that work financially, technically, all that information exists, and they were willing to share it. And I just introduced before this conference to say, can we get them along to talk about this? But I'm happy putting you in touch with them to talk to them directly, because that's been spoken about throughout Spain and throughout Europe. So the one-stop shop thing, box ticked, we're done. But just on that just transition front, we're talking a lot about retrofit, but in terms of the housing conditions people in Scotland are living in, it's kind of environmental and public health crime, to be very honest. But we're not talking about maintenance cycles. It's probably like the least exciting thing about retrofit. If you want to drum up demand, the fastest way is to have a legally enforced maintenance cycle that if a landlord does not do, they cannot be a landlord. We cannot be doing fines when we are running out of time in terms of climate crisis. So we've heard that in 6 years, we crossed 1.5 degrees, and by 2026, the UK construction industry surpasses its fair share 1.5 degrees carbon budget. We don't have 6 years, we've got less than 1,000 days, and everything we do after 1,000 days, we are essentially stealing from the rest of the world's budget. So we don't have all this carbon that we can just throw at the wall to solve all these problems. We've got to put the justice at the centre of this. So how can and how will you take it forward to have enforced maintenance cycles? Because we've seen some of the best moves around retrofit and maintenance have not come from our industry, they have not come from our government, they've come from tenants' unions. So we need to be engaging far more with the people that live in the housing. So there was the Just Transition for Tenants that was proposed before COP26. That's received little support from government, locally, nationally. It's received no industry support. I know this because I was the one person from industry who helped write it. So there was no support from industry on that front whatsoever. So how are you going to make sure that we have an enforced maintenance cycle? Because if you want to ensure there's going to be demand for this market that we put so much faith in that doesn't work, that puts profit before life, landscapes and communities, how do you put that maintenance cycle in? Because without a maintenance cycle, all the buildings standing up that are currently causing asthma, people are dying and fuel poverty. Without a maintenance cycle, people will die. So how soon is that coming in Scotland? That's my question.
Yeah, it's a really fair and well-made point. The truth is, it's not something that the government, I'm not a member of the government, but it's not something that I know the government is currently planning to do. I think it's something the Parliament should certainly hold the government to account on, and I would be more than happy to sort of help organise with like-minded individuals to do that. I've long thought that we need to have compulsory maintenance standards in housing. We do it for cars, why not for the thing that people spend most of their lives in, which is their homes. And where we do have situations where people are dependent on landlordism to maintain properties to high standards, the landlords should be held to that standard, and if they're not able to adhere to that standard, then there should be a backstop, which is basically a compulsory purchase by a registered social landlord, which you would hope would be statutorily obliged to maintain that standard anyway, and would be provided with sufficient funding, public funding, to do so. So that would be my kind of rough and ready response to that in terms of what I'd want it to look like. Whether we can hold the government to that or not, there's going to be a housing bill, so let's try and amend that bill if the government won't put that on the face of the bill. But what I would say is get engaged through the Public Petitions Committee, get engaged through the Housing Committee to make those points as vociferously as possible. The Parliament's committees aren't just there for corporate lobbyists, they're there for everyone. But not a lot of people necessarily have the agency or time, headspace to organise to do that. So, do get involved if you can, and let's start organising that. Similarly with the tenants unions, I think they do a great job in the city, but I think They also need to get organised in terms of the RSLs. Too many of the registered social landlords in the city, particularly community ones, their governance structures are quite weak. We need to get them infused with more young people, more people who are agitated about these issues, to get it reflected in the governance of these housing associations. I think that's a huge challenge that we need to do. I think there's a big imbalance in the demographics on a lot of these boards. So I would encourage people not just to get into tenants unions, but also to get into housing associations as well, because they were, after all, created by citizens that moved to do something to change and improve their communities.
This one came in from Drew Roger, and it relates into all of the things we've just been talking about. And he's saying, are we aware there's the issue that he's saying developers, I'm not sure if it's specifically in Glasgow, but I think it's generally land banking empty buildings, and waiting for them to deteriorate, and that's sometimes apparently even enabled by being given grants by whether it's central or local government, and then just becoming unsightly, and then the council want to get rid of them. But it's the sort of not having that regular maintenance requirement. Do you see a way to deal with that? Is that a sort of particular issue that can be addressed?
Yeah, compulsory purchase powers are they are the only currently available mechanism to deal with land banking. But they are quite difficult and complex and unwieldy to use. So a good example just announced this week actually was that New Gorbals Housing Association is about to undertake a back-to-back compulsory purchase order on a building in Bridge Street in the Gorbals, which was used as basically an unregistered, unlicensed slum. And they're going to demolish the building and construct new social housing as a result when they cleared site. There's another recent example where the Beco building, a B-listed warehouse in Tradeston, was acquired by Barclays under a back-to-back CPO and has been turned into a sort of Eagle Labs, it's called. It's like a kind of startup incubator. But I don't think we shouldn't be relying on big corporate investors to take the risk. We need the state to step up and be much more dynamic and engaged in working with communities to acquire land that's been used antisocially by speculators and investors. There's another way to reform this, which would be looking at the tax system as well. We've got a fairly obsolete system of taxation when it comes to council tax and business rates that drives all sorts of horrendous behaviours and destroys economic activity. So looking at opportunities for the land value tax would be, I think it's the most efficient tax ever devised yet never implemented. So looking at how we move towards that. One of the big challenges about transitioning from council tax, it was the current government's manifesto commitment in 2007, it's never been done, is actually how do you create that cliff edge? How do you switch it on and switch how do you switch that off and switch the new tax on? The way to really do it would be to taper it in over a period of time, so you're gradually turning the heat up on it. Land banking is a huge scourge and it denies a lot of opportunity to this city. I think we've got slightly better at using CPOs to unlock sites, but it's only ever done in a back-to-back deal, usually with a corporate sponsor. So we need to get better at empowering communities to use that tool as well. Maybe using the Scottish Land Fund more regularly, because it's often talked about in the context of rural communities and islands and so on. We've not really talked about it enough in an urban context, so let's look at that as well. Hopefully that's answered the question. I share your impatience and I share your frustration. I'm not someone who wanted to get into politics just to sit around and just be a spectator. I want to get stuff done, right? So and this is a huge area that agitates me every day. Everyone's got skin in the game here, so just to say, I'm not standing back expecting everyone to sort of deliver a neatly packaged solution, but I think it's important that we all realise it's just down to us to fix it. You know what I mean? There isn't somebody up in a room somewhere that's got all the ideas and is sorting it out for us. So if you've got things you want us to impress on government, fire in, and I'll be doing my best to try and make the case. So thanks very much for your time. Okay.